Welcome to Understanding the Bible, the Story of a Book, with Greg Salyer. So last time we talked about the Bible in its times, the last two times, in fact, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the Bible after its times, because it's there that there were choices made that changed everything, as you will see. So what we're talking about here is called the canon. It's a noun. You may know this as a religious word. In general, a law, a rule, a principle, or a criterion by which something is judged. The appointment, for example, the appointment violated the canons of fair play and equal opportunity. So it's a church decree or law. The Catholic Church has canon law. And a collection of sacred books, for our purposes, a collection of or list of sacred books accepted as genuine, the formation of the biblical canon, for example. We also use this, I'm actually a literature professor, we also use this in terms of literature, the works of a particular author or artist that are recognized as genuine, such as the Shakespeare canon. And then more commonly, the list of works considered to be permanently established as being of the highest quality. Gerard Manley Hopkins was firmly established in the canon of English poetry. Also, for Catholics, the part of the Mass containing the words of consecration. So, we do have this notion of the canon, as I noted here in the definition. It applies to not only religious texts, especially Jewish and Christian texts, but also to literary text. I can remember in my doctoral program very earnest discussions of whether or not Toni Morrison was part of the canon, and older, crustier professors saying no, in part because she was still alive. So anyway, let's not get into all that. But it's. I mention it because it's a human phenomenon, born out of our concern with authenticity. And authenticity is incredibly problematic. I hope you've seen that in the lectures so far. The notion of authenticity is rife with ideological assumptions about everything from the nature of writing to the nature of time. And you see this come into play where something older is more authentic, is the general assumption, but highly, highly problematic, as you no doubt know. So let's start with the Hebrew Bible, the canon of the Hebrew Bible. So you can see there in the graphic, and probably looks familiar to you, to some of you. So you will see there at the bottom of the first column some books that may not be familiar to you unless you're Catholic, unless you grew up Catholic, or are Catholic, I guess. Catholics accept what's called they call the Old Testament Apocrypha. Protestants do not. So if you grew up or are Protestant, you won't recognize these. But this gets so complicated and so messy so quickly, you're going to see. So there was a nice story that biblical scholars told for many years and still tell. And I don't mean to be disparaging, I just mean that any kind of story that presents this process of canonization, it's clean and simple, is highly suspect, because it isn't. So there was this story that biblical scholars, scholars of the Hebrew Bible, like to tell about the council at Yamnia, which is that this was when the Hebrew Bible was fixed. It was canonized, or I should say, let me rephrase that. I should say the process of canonization came to a close. All right, so seems pretty clear that the Torah, the first five books, the Pentateuch, was pretty much settled about 400 BCE. Again, note that date. That's around the time of the Second Temple, when Jews are in exile. The Nevi'im, that is the prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Daniel, the others, appeared to be established about 200 years later, 200 BCE. And then this process was finalized in 90 of the Common Era, so after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, with the Ketuvim, which you remember are the poetic and philosophical works of the Hebrew Bible. So that the prevailing opinion was that that's when the Hebrew Bible was closed. So settled about 400 BCE on the Torah, about 200 BCE on the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and about 90 of the Common Era on the writings. Again, it's a nice story because you have the Hebrew Bible being closed only 20 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in the Jewish-Roman War. I guess we should put war in quotation marks because the Jews were incredibly outnumbered. The war lasted 66 to 70, ended with the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple. So it's nice, and it fits a nice narrative that after that destruction, they would finalize the Hebrew Bible. And I'm not saying they didn't. It's just, it was a little more messy than that, the Council at Yamnia. So again, the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era was one of the most significant events in Jewish history and in Christian history by extension. And it's not incorrect to say that the efforts of the council to kind of make a decision about what goes in the Hebrew Bible was significant because of the destruction of the temple, because Judaism once again had to move from a ritual center in a building called the temple to an interpretive religious set of religious practices having to do with the text. This is huge. It has all kinds of significance, both anthropologically, where instead of focusing on rituals, you focus on reading, to just theology and everything else. So it's not wrong to say that this was important. What's wrong to say about the Council at Yamnia is that it was all neat and clean. The problem is that the canon process just doesn't work like that. There's never a closing, for example. There's never, I mean, there are attempts, but there's never a closing of the canon, really. Well, maybe that's too strong. We'll talk about it. We'll see. But at least in the time of the decision-making process, the choices that changed everything, there was not a sense that that we have made the statement and now it's closed. What happens is you've made this statement, there are a lot more arguments, and there are a lot more texts that appear, like in the New Testament, the Gospel of Thomas, that wasn't known for millennia after it was originally known. Um, so there are big gaps. And anyway, I don't think I'm belaboring this point, but anytime you see a statement that the canon process was simple and clean and clear cut, be suspicious, because it's an argument that doesn't get closed by argument. It gets closed by practice. Like, okay, yeah, okay, I don't know what this other book is, but I know what's in my Bible, so I'm not going to look at this other book. It's much less dramatic and philosophical in practice. All right, enough of that. So, as I mentioned, it's pretty clear that the Torah was settled in the 5th century BCE. And how do we know such things? Well, from the text itself. And again, it's like the canon process. It's not that so much that scriptural writers say, and now see here, let me address your concerns, scholars of the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries, and say that this text is settled for me. It's offhand, it's casual. So there's a scribe at the Second Temple period named Ezra, and he just says in passing that he was skilled in the Torah of Moses, that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. That's Ezra chapter 7, verse 6. So again, it's these casual, everybody knows this goes without saying sort of comments that are incredibly revealing. So the Torah of Moses then was a thing. It was an understood thing at the time of Ezra, which is in the 400s BC. Okay? It also means that writing is present, right? Because he's a scribe. So writing is permeating that culture. And people are scribes who are, and it's not just the priests now, but it's other elites. So very revealing, but not a direct comment on the canonization process. The Nevi'im, as I mentioned, 2nd century BCE. And you get this phrasing, well, there's a prologue to one of the apocryphal works, The Wisdom of Ben Sirach, that refers to the law and the prophets and the others. Okay. And you find this in the New Testament in Matthew and Luke, the law and the prophets. So notice that phrasing. That's right. That's the Tanakh. That's the Torah and the Nevi'im, right? And it was considered just a given that these were the the categories of the Hebrew Bible. And the reason we think that the Nevi'im, the second part of the Hebrew Bible, was finalized by the 2nd century and not later, is that there are books of the Hebrew Bible that could have been included, but are not. Thus, for example, Daniel seems to be a prophetic book, but it's not included in the prophets. Why not? Because the canon of the prophets was probably already fixed by the time the book of Daniel appeared on the scene in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. So you see how messy this is already? And at the same time, you're going to see Daniel referred to as a prophet in later, after the canonization process kind of reaches a stable point. Now, the Ketuvim, as I mentioned in the lecture on the Hebrew Bible, is highly problematic. And I love these divisions of the Hebrew Bible because they're so interesting. And they make a certain amount of religious and anthropological sense. The Torah, the law, excuse me, including the Ten Commandments, kind of establishes, not kind of, it definitely establishes the religion. The Nevi'im contains exhortations to follow the law after you've forgotten right? The Ten Commandments and the other laws. And then the Ketuvim, the writings, the poetry, and the philosophy is kind of like, well, what are we doing here really? Like, does this really mean that? When in fact, when I look at the world and live my life, I think this, it's very contemplative and philosophical and also poetic, a kind of adherence to and celebration of beauty, especially in suffering, poetry of suffering, right? So this makes sense to me, this progression. And of course, there are problems. You always get problems in that third stage where the sacred text now becomes an object of reflection for poets and philosophers. And so you've got the book of Job, that is the most problematic text in the Hebrew Bible in terms of canonization, but also in terms of interpretation, because I would venture to say it's the most misread text in the Bible. And I have a lecture on Job that I'll post for you, or maybe I'll do the podcast. I guess I'll do the podcast. It's a text that's so radical in its understanding of God and suffering that you can literally see the editors changing it. You can see where pieces are added that don't fit, but they do calm the nerves of readers and users of the text. Ecclesiastes, very philosophical. Koheleth, it's called in Hebrew, which means the preacher. And the preacher's trying to figure out what to preach. And it's vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That comes out of Ecclesiastes. There's a time and a season for everything. That comes out of Ecclesiastes. And the rock group, the Birds. I mentioned in the Hebrew Bible lecture about this wonderful book called The Song of Songs. That's an unabashed celebration of sexual love, not romantic love, sexual love. Very common in ancient Mesopotamia, with texts about Inanna or Ishtar and the other goddesses. This was just obvious that sex was important and something to be celebrated. And they did so with very graphic language in the texts about these, especially the female goddesses. So Song of Songs comes out of that genre, does not mention the word God at all. There's no theology. It's just and it might even have been a tavern song that got put into the Bible. It's rated R, I would say, if we made it a film. But it's in the Hebrew Bible. And it is gorgeous. And of course, later writers again tried to diminish the immediate effect of the work as they did Job and say, well, it's an allegory of God's love. Really? Have you read how sexual, how erotic this is? And the language is very directly erotic, poetically erotic, I should say. Anyway, so you can see why people concerned with what to count in the book would say, hey, do we really need this erotic poem in our sacred scripture? Apparently you do, because it's in there. All right, so what are the criteria for inclusion? And again, let me emphasize, if I haven't beaten this horse to death enough already, these are loose criteria. They are not, very strategic and tactical. They're not like, okay, here are the criteria, let's apply the criteria. It's more like, given what we have in the Hebrew Bible, it appears that these were the criteria for inclusion. And I say that, and I know that because there are always exceptions. So the main criterion for inclusion in the Hebrew Bible is language. Now, this is interesting and unique in the Semitic world because, for example, in Islam, the Quran is in Arabic because God speaks Arabic. It's not so strong an assumption in the Hebrew Bible, but it's an assumption kind of lurking around there that God speaks Hebrew. So if you have a text that might be considered for inclusion and it's written in Hittite, um, you're probably that's probably strike one, right? Because the language was unique to the people, the Hebrew or Hebrews. And so if you've got a text from another language, that's immediately suspect. Having said that, in the messy process of canonization, you actually have some Aramaic and a couple other, there's some Babylonian in the Hebrew Bible as well. So again, it's not a hard and fast rule. There are Aramaic texts in the Hebrew Bible. And there are Aramaisms, which is another Semitic language, but still it's not Hebrew, in the book of Job. Anyway, language is itself highly problematic, as we're going to look at in the lecture on hermeneutics. But generally, if it's a Hebrew text or a story in Hebrew, you've passed the first test. Age is the second test, and again, I don't mean to imply test in a hard and fast sense, but obviously, the older the text is, or is believed to be, the better chance it has at being included. And this is fairly simple and commonsensical. You want texts that come, if you're doing a canon, if you're creating a canon, a list of authoritative books for belief and practice. And if your religion is founded on historical events, like historical events and people, like Abraham, Moses, etc., or Jesus and Paul, the closer the texts are to those events and personages, generally the better. Always exceptions, always exceptions. And that's how we get, especially the New Testament, Apocrypha, which is a word that means hidden, because there are a lot of texts about Jesus that didn't make it in. And honestly, I think the most powerful criterion is use. Use. Just, what gets read in the synagogue? And what do people respond to in the synagogue? It's interesting to see, if you've been in churches or temples or synagogues or any other, especially Western religious space, to see what gets chosen. So there's a kind of secondary canonization process at work in use. So, right, for example, I grew up as a Southern Baptist and heard Southern Baptist preachers in my youth. Well, if you look at the canon of use, it's pretty limited, right? So we're not going to be spending a lot of time on the Hebrew dietary laws in Leviticus. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the Bible's, Leviticus again, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible's statements on slavery, because they are extremely uncomfortable. They assume slavery, and the Hebrew Bible even promotes it under circumstances of entering the Promised Land. So You're not going to spend a lot of time there. And I remember a radical, wild visiting preacher who would come to our church who would talk about the book of Revelation, which nobody else wanted to touch. So this was in the 80s, and he would give these fiery sermons on how the book of Revelation was about Russia. It was about Russia. So then it was the Soviet Union. And he would say, this is what the book of Revelation is talking about. It's talking about the Soviet Union. Okay. Really powerful stuff. Um, and brave in the sense that, you're dealing with this text. Of course, he dealt with it poorly and in a ridiculous manner. But use is so important, and it's true in the New Testament as well. What gets used, right? So there's the canon in terms of what's in your Bible, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, and then there's the canon of use, which theoretically, historically includes those books, but practically includes a very, very small piece of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. The exception here is the Torah, which gets read in the synagogue over the year. So they don't shy away from their text, including Leviticus in its awkwardness. All right, let's turn now to the New Testament and look at some motivating factors for creating a New Testament canon. And the first of these is the Tanakh itself. So again, you've got Christianity that emerges as a Jewish sect led by a Jew named Yeshua ben Joseph, Jesus. You're going to need to decide your texts, the text you're going to use, the text that you deem authoritative, based on how it lines up with the Tanakh. Because remember, Matthew, the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, sees a direct line from the Hebrew Bible to Jesus. And in fact, you can see this in the genealogies of Matthew and Luke. It's really interesting. So Matthew has Jesus as the son of David, right? And he begins his genealogy with Abraham, the father of Judaism. So Abraham, David, Jesus, nice straight line. So that lines up beautifully. Luke, not so much. Luke is a more of a Gentile. His writing is for a Gentile audience more so. So he does the genealogy too, but he goes back to Adam, right? To Adam. So he's not too concerned. He is concerned, I shouldn't say it that way, but he's not as concerned as Matthew. And let's put Matthew and Luke and all these people in quotation marks when I say them. He's not as concerned as Matthew to make the connection to Judaism. At the same time, you cannot deny the connection. It's just a question of what you want to emphasize. All right. So, if you're deciding what counts in the New Testament, the Tanakh is going to be an important feature, especially passages, sections that deal with the Messiah. If you're going to see your God as the fulfillment of these prophecies, then you better line them up. Now, they didn't do a good job, actually, these New Testament writers. But then it was almost an impossible task anyway, because the Messiah of Isaiah, for example, is a political figure who establishes a new kingdom and returns the kingdom. Obviously, these prophets are writing during exile. So they want to go back to when they had a kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. So this Messiah is a vehicle for getting them back there. New Testament writers have to flip that. Well, they have a couple of steps. Um, they have to say Jesus is the Messiah, therefore he's going to overthrow Rome. And then when he doesn't do that, they have to have another interpretation, called it call it the kingdom of God, and it's really within you. So sorry we couldn't get rid of the Romans, but you have a kingdom within you. Um, Very different from the Hebrew Bible because of the compressed nature of the New Testament. The sayings of Jesus are of great importance. Different from the Hebrew Bible because, the sayings of Abraham, the sayings of Moses are long gone. So there's no sense that there's like a generation of people writing this text that knew of those people, or their grandparents' generation didn't know of Abraham and Moses. But that's not true of the New Testament writers. Um, they were live witnesses to Jesus, and I think Jesus existed. I don't see any reason to think he did not. So I think he was an historical figure, but unlike with Abraham and Moses, you have people writing who remember, and that's really important. So the sayings of Jesus become incredibly important. After all, he's your Messiah. So you want to make sure you capture all his words, unless those words sound a little too Gnostic-y for you. We're not going to count those words, even if they're early, even if they're our earliest account. Letters of Paul. So yeah, I mentioned this in the New Testament lecture. The New Testament is Paul. In fact, there's an interesting debate between the theology of Jesus and the theology of Paul. The theology of Jesus is complex. No, I don't know that it's complex. It's contradictory at times. Um, and so Jesus speaks in parables, for example. So he doesn't shy away from the esoteric, the mysterious. In fact, he embraces it. And so you've got a lot of Jesus sayings that, and you see this reaction in the text where the disciples go, "What is he talking about? Wait, I'm the door. He's a real door. I am the bread. Wait, he's bread. We eat. What is?" And they're wonderful literary characters because they're so stupid. Paul is completely different. He is not very much interested in poetry or philosophy, though he can do that. He's not very interested in mysticism. He's um he's a Roman, and he was a Pharisee before he became a Christian. He actually persecuted Christians before he had his experience on the road to Damascus. And the road to Damascus was to kill some Christians, by the way. So his writing is, I mean, it can be beautiful at times, but it's um, it's a manager's writing. He's trying to manage these churches. So he's running around founding these churches or supporting existing churches in the Roman world, like Corinth and Ephesus and Thessalonica and Rome, even it ends up in Spain. Um, and so he founds these churches, and he has to keep going. He has to keep founding more churches. So he writes these letters back, like, "Hey, look, don't do that. Do this, and for that problem, use this solution." He's a manager. He's trying to manage these churches, but his these letters get taken up and become the bulk of the New Testament. As I said before in the New Testament lecture, he at times thinks this might happen and he's okay with it, and at other times he's not. And he says, "Look, I'm just being a manager here. Don't consider this the word of the Lord." And he has some incredibly difficult problems that you can read about in managing a church. Can you imagine trying to manage a church? fledgling Christian church in the Roman Empire, which was still essentially Greek culture. So there's this famous example in Corinth where a stepson was sleeping with his stepmother in the. I mean, they were part of the church, and the churches were little. These were not big. These were household churches. So what, 10 people at most, and two of them are having sex, and they're somewhat related. Anyway, and Paul has to deal with these things. There's also the whole circumcision issue where Paul gets incredibly pissed off at the Peter and James contingent, where they're followers of Peter and James who come behind Paul after he founds a church and say, Paul's great and everything, but doesn't understand Judaism like we do and this new Christianity. So he says, great that you've started this church. We're going to need you to be circumcised, which was decided upon, apparently, in Jerusalem when Paul met with Peter and James and decided that new Christians did not have to be circumcised. Paul gets so pissed at this when he's writing to the church in Galatia. He says, well, I wish these people would just go ahead and cut their dicks off. I mean, that's in the New Testament. I think the word that gets translated is they should go ahead and emasculate themselves. They should finish the job if they want people to be circumcised, and they should finish it on themselves. Crazy. None of this stuff gets out in the world, right? When we're talking about the Bible, it's really fascinating. So, right, a part of the New Testament canonization process is distinguishing what here is new in the New Testament. So this is very tricky, right? It's the situation I was just describing with Paul and Peter, these two notions of what it means to be a Christian. Are you just a Jew with a new outlook and a new teacher? Or are you a Christian that is a religion for everyone in the Roman world without the typical rites of passage required of Jews? And that is very tricky. And it's largely unresolved in the New Testament that we have. I think it's resolved in practice for the most part, because most Christians do not identify in any way as Jewish. I suppose there are fundamentalist Christians who say it's important to support Israel, but that everything I've read about that is completely disingenuous. It's just a political move. Anyway, you've also got this problem that is not as prominent in the Hebrew Bible because of its age, and that's the loss of the founder. So you've got this dynamic founder of a new religion who says things like people never heard before, who claims for himself divinity, and not surprisingly gets killed for that. So again, this is a global problem with any religion that has a founder. Judaism doesn't really have the problem because of the age and because Abraham was a reluctant founder and not special in any particular sense other than God, Yahweh, taps him on the shoulder one day in Mesopotamia and says, hey, I want you to go over here, and basically tortures him. I mean, there's a kind of psychological torture. And anyway, I don't want to get into that. God tells him to sacrifice his son and all that. With Jesus, it's very different. You've got an incredibly dynamic founder who makes outlandish claims, but does so in a way that's extremely compelling and offers a new hermeneutic, a new interpretation of text that you thought you understood, and then gets killed for it. To lose that in any religion is traumatic. And what replaces the founder in every case is a text. Just as the Hebrew Bible replaced the temple, the New Testament replaces Jesus. Same thing happened with Buddhism when Siddhartha Gautama died. You create the Dhammapada, the sayings of the Buddha. Same thing. You've got to have something to fill in the void of the loss of the founder. Same thing in Islam. And that's part of the process of the canonization of the New Testament, is this has to stand in. Whatever we decide here has to stand in for our founder. So what are the criteria of the New Testament? Similar, but a little different. Antiquity. How close to the events and to the person of Jesus are these texts? So you'll find a whole genre of literature from like the 2nd and 3rd centuries about Jesus that's really interesting, but it's basically fiction. And as fiction is very interesting. But if you've got Peter writing, or James, or John, one of the disciples who traveled with your founder, then that's going to have a lot of power. Speaking of which, apostolicity. So there are people who were eyewitnesses of Jesus, and told stories. Certainly, I'm trying to remember if any of them wrote anything. Well, yeah, they did. You've got the Gospel of Mary, for example, in the New Testament canon. Apocrypha. But she's not in the canon because her book's not in the canon because of apostolicity. If it was one of the 12 apostles minus Judas, take out Judas, replace Paul, then that's going to give it much more weight. But keep in mind what we talked about, how people writing would use the names of prominent people as the author. It's called pseudepigrapha, false writings. But it wasn't really false back then, because the notion of false and true, of authenticity, was very different. But if you could claim, as the Gospels do, to be writing as Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or John, then we better listen to you, and we probably should include your work, your gospel, your letter in the New Testament, unless it's Thomas, because Thomas is too weird. Catholicity, an interesting criterion that could only develop post 313 of the Common Era, because you don't want Catholicity until it's safe to be Christian. And it wasn't safe to be Christian until after Constantine declared Christianity the official religion of Rome. And then, of course, orthodoxy, which is really the only criterion, frankly, especially for the New Testament, which is heavy in theology and in dogma. Well, let me put it this way: the councils who decided canonicity were very concerned with dogma and theology, as you should be, if you're trying to create a canon. So there's all kinds of Christianities floating around in the 1st century, and the 2nd century, and 3rd century. And I've mentioned before in the New Testament lecture, the most prominent one was a Gnostic version of Christianity, which antedates Jesus. We find it in Egypt. But anyway, let's not get into that. The orthodoxy is, was Jesus human? Yes. Therefore, any text that purports to present Jesus as simply divine and not human, not simply, but solely divine and not human, cannot be included. And just the opposite. If you have a text, I don't think there actually were any of these, but if you have a text that says Jesus is human and not divine, cannot include it because it's not Orthodox theology. Notice that the orthodoxy exists before the canon, or at least it's a prevailing feature of the canon. It's not like they took all the text in existence and said, well, let's see if we can put together what Jesus actually said and did and meant. It's not that. It's like, what are we already using? What do we already believe? What decisions have we already made that we can apply to this canonization process? Speaking of which, very interesting. There's a dude called Marcion, a really interesting guy. He was a ship owner and a merchant, the son of a bishop of a church in Asia Minor. And I love this guy. He's really interesting. He says the new Christian church, remember we talked about this tension between what makes it new versus Old Testament. Marcion says, you know what? No Jewish scripture should be in the Christian Bible. And he develops a kind of a double criteria, a set of double criteria. One gospel, Luke, and one apostle, Paul. So Luke, Acts, and Paul's letters, and that's it. So his belief was that, the Old Testament is old. It doesn't apply to us. Christianity is so new. Jesus is so different that we don't need to concern ourselves with these other texts. We need only to concern ourselves with Luke, who's not so interested in making the Jewish connection, remember? So all those other writers we're not interested in, and Paul, because Paul is actually not honestly, but technically the founder of Christianity. A founder, I guess. I don't know. Without Paul, there's no Christianity because he creates these churches outside of Jerusalem. So stop using the Hebrew Bible completely, and then we'll just use Luke and Paul. And when Luke and Paul do refer to Judaism, let's just skip over that. So he just removes these references to Judaism. I kind of like this guy's audacity, and honestly, if people listen to him, it'd be a very different Christianity that we have today. All right. So then there's so Marcion made people incredibly uncomfortable, which is another reason I like him. But his criterion of apostle and Paul kind of carried forth into the later discussion. So there was the Muratorian canon. So again, this is a determination by use, probably into the 2nd century, and it's basically a list of texts you use in the house churches in Rome. All right, so use these. And then Eusebius, 325 of the Common Era. So now take note, we're 300 years after the event, and we're still trying to decide what counts. So Eusebius kind of follows up on the Muratorian canon with 20 books that he divides into 3 categories that are very useful categories: acknowledged, disputed, and rejected. And so that's kind of the tripartite division that most of the early church fathers used. There's Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon in Gaul, which is France. About 185 of the Common Era agreed with these 20 books that later appeared in Eusebius in the acknowledged category. But Irenaeus does something interesting. He recognized the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, for the first time and the Shepherd of Hermas, which is a text you don't know because it eventually didn't get counted. Excuse me. So he now adds two more. Now, the book of Revelation was contested right up until Martin Luther in the 16th century, where he didn't want it in there because it was too freaking weird. Um, so it has its own interesting history. Origin, he Origin of Alexandria, the most important city in the ancient world, um, endorsed these 22 writings, the Shepherd of Hermas with Apocalypse. Um, so remember, Marcion, the weirdo, proposes his canon of Luke, Acts, and Paul, and cut out all the references to Jewish history and theology. We're not too much. I'm not too far from his orthodox list of apostolicity and Paul. And Paul gets counted as an apostle, by the way, because he saw Jesus on the Damascus road, the road to Damascus. The criterion for being an apostle is that you saw and talked and walked with Jesus. And Paul gets in under a technicality because he saw Jesus after he had died and was resurrected. So gospel and apostle, still very powerful, and it takes Athanasius. These debates keep going. Remember that we're at 22, and there are in fact 27 now in this canon. So the debates go on for a long time until Athanasius, 367. 367 of the Common Era. Again, note that date. 50 years after Constantine declares Christianity the official religion of Rome. Now we've got a set of books, and it's the books that you would have on your shelf right now. He was an influential bishop in Alexandria, again in Egypt. He sends this letter to the churches that he knows, and he says, look, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, and these other books are worth reading and interesting, but these 27 are canonical. So very interesting process, fraught process, messy process. And again, we're still not sure about the book of Revelation. And even the letter to the Hebrews is suspect in this. All right, so let me just very quickly go through what the Apocrypha, that is the books that did not make it into the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament Apocrypha. Let me show you what they are just briefly and provide some brief commentary. Again, if you grew up Catholic, you will recognize these from the Hebrew Bible. Catholics do not accept the New Testament Apocrypha. But if you grew up Protestant, these will be new. So there's historical writings for 2nd and 3rd Maccabees, 1st Esdras, versions of the Psalms, Prayer Manasseh, Psalm 151. Then there's the wisdom literature, Baruch, and these get different names because, again, there were no real titles in the ancient world. 4th Maccabees, you may know that name Maccabee, which, well, I can't get into, but it involves Hellenistic Judaism and Hanukkah, actually. Wisdom of Solomon, Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes. And then there's a lot of apocalyptic, like apocalyptic, the unveiling, the dramatic unveiling with lots of violence and spectacle. Novelistic writings, these are fun. So you've got Tobit, you've got Judith, you've got Esther, the additions to Esther. So Esther is a great novelistic tale in the canon, but you've got some additions to Esther with a little more events. Additions to Daniel. So see how this is looking? Additions to Daniel. Oh my God, Susanna, one of my favorites. Susanna and the Elders, which you probably haven't heard of, which I think would be a great 50s woman rock group. Susanna and the Elders. Bell and the Dragon. You can see this is orality at work, mainly. Excess of stories, stories building upon stories, more stories, give us more stories, right? So the New Testament, the Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, as I mentioned in the New Testament lectures, the earliest saying source of Jesus. It's weird and wonderful, and it's not in your Bible. Now, there's also the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is so fun to read. In the canonical Gospels, we know nothing of Jesus' childhood except at 12, he goes, I think he goes to the synagogue, not the temple. He goes in and he talks with the elders, and he's 12, and he blows everybody away with his knowledge of the Hebrew Bible. That's all we know until he begins his ministry at around age 29. The infancy Gospel of Thomas tells some great stories about Jesus' childhood. I mean, imagine the Son of God as a child. It's a wonderful idea for a Netflix series, you know? And it would be a comedy and a tragedy as well. And if you read it, you'll see there's one scene where he meets Judas as a child. There's a scene where he stays as a baby. Joseph and Mary are on the way to Egypt to flee Herod's decree, and they stop overnight in the home of a man who is impotent, and Jesus is an infant, but because Jesus, the Son of God, is staying with him, his erectile dysfunction is cured. It's wonderful, and wow, you can kind of see why they didn't include some of it. There's the gospel of perfection, the gospel of truth, the proto-evangelium of James, gospel of Judas, because, you know, we want to hear from Judas, gospel of Peter, gospel of Eve. How cool is that? Gospel of Mary. There are Acts, which are interesting. So you know that Luke is the gospel, and the second scroll is what happens with the new Christians, the brand new Christians of the era. So that becomes a genre too. Acts of Andrew and Matthias among the cannibals. Ooh. Barnabas, who is Paul's buddy. Bartholomew, John, and Acts of John. Acts of Paul and Thecla is a really interesting text where Thecla is married to a Roman, some Roman official, and she's leaning out the window and hearing Paul speak and pretty much falls in love with him. Oh, so much. Acts of Peter, etc. Again, Acts of Thomas with this little tale called the Hymn of the Pearl, which is beautiful. I'm just showing you these so you know what you're missing, that these are texts that were in existence during the time of canonization, but were not included. So lots of letters, 3rd Corinthians, isn't that awesome? Yeah, there's a famous forgery purporting to have been written by Jesus to Abgar, king of Edessa. Um, you know, of course, this is going to happen. There are a lot of apocalypses. 2 James, the Virgin Mary has an apocalypse. Paul, of course, Peter. Because apocalypse is great. It's like an early version of the horror film, or even the action film. The didache I mentioned before, it means the 12, the teaching of the 12. It's the Greek word for 12. Really interesting, kind of beautiful. Well, beautiful is not the right word. Kind of just interesting text. The Shepherd of Hermas is pretty beautiful. Kerygma of Peter, Dialogue of the Redeemer, Pistis Sophia, a very powerful Gnostic text, still referenced and used by Gnostics, The Wisdom of Jesus Christ, etc. All right, so let's wrap this up. So, the Bible after its times. Remember, so this is after the events have occurred, and we're now trying to sift through and decide what counts for our scripture, for our Bible, our collection of books. So I'm not going to listen to anyone speak on the Bible who's not going to reference the process of canonization. Because if you're going to pretend that this all fell from the sky as is and ignore the historical, theological, and literary processes that took place, then you have nothing to say to me. Why would you ignore this process? It's incredible. And it's not, it doesn't have to take away from what you want to say as a Christian or a Jew, but not engaging it means you're hiding something and just not interested. It's a process of inclusion, to be sure, but it's mostly a process of exclusion. Remember, these choices have already been made in practice. I'm going to use this text because I like it in my synagogue or in my little home church or in my official Roman church after 313. Some of those texts got excluded for other reasons, but largely this was the main criterion. It's already in use. The choices have already been made. What I don't want to use is this weird apocalypse thing with angels and trumpets and veils and a lake of fire. But of course, that eventually gets incorporated too. Canonization was political and theological. If I'm a church father, that is an early leader in the Christian church, and I'm under Vespasian, the Roman emperor, or Domitian, who is even worse, and I read this book of Revelation, this apocalypse, and it's thinly veiled references to Rome and how God's going to destroy it. You know what? I'm probably not going to venture there because it could get me killed. And then there were less dramatic reasons, just, political and theological. Gnosticism comes out of Egypt. Do we really want Gnostic stuff in our, Jerusalem and now Gentile Bible? Theological, what's the nature of Jesus? Is he human, divine, both, and in what relation? And in the Hebrew Bible, it's like I said, Song of Songs. Do we want to talk about erotic love in our canon? Apparently we do, because it's in there. Do we want a problematic text, a challenging text, I should say, like Job, in our Bible? And I'm happy to say that it's there, although it's, again, they're like 5 levels of canonization. So you've got the book of Job in there, but it's been so heavily edited by later editors that it's not as dangerous as it was in its original form, or at least in its earliest form. And then it's the first step in creating doctrine and dogma. So it's not surprising that right after Athanasius, you begin to have the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon. And now what they're determining is not texts. I mean, they talk about that, but it's doctrine and dogma. Because you cannot create doctrine and dogma unless you have an authoritative list or a list of authoritative books. So if you're trying to create doctrine and dogma for your now official church of the Roman Empire, how are you going to incorporate a Gnostic text, which is radically different from the non-Gnostic Gospels and writings? You're going to have to cut some things out. We're going to talk about this more in the lecture on the institutionalization of the text, which is a process of exclusion for the sake of doctrine and dogma. It's kind of another canonization process, like I intimated a while ago, for what gets actually preached in synagogues and churches. But that's to come. And thank you for listening. I'll see you in there.